You, Denise, yesterday with Jonathan, and you did a comprehension lesson with him. So can you tell me a little bit about how your lesson went, and also maybe reflect on your objectives? So, you told me your objectives of the lesson were to accurately identify the elements of the story using a story map, and so part of that story map was character, setting, plot, problem, solution, and theme. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So yesterday with Jonathan, we read the Mo Willems book, Knuffle Bunny, which he had actually never read before. So initially, I actually assumed that he had read it before because it's so popular. So I was hoping that familiarity would kind of aid in our understanding of those story elements. So at the very beginning, I kind of had to adjust my thinking when I realized that he had not read the book before. But he was very engaged in the text, and he was very engaged in the activity, and he understood the objective from the beginning, which is to understand those story elements. He likes to kind of interrupt me sometimes when he gets excited about things, so he kept telling me about the story elements before we had to stop and break them down and kind of talk about what they were before moving on to reading the story. And by using that graphic organizer, I also hope that it helps him sort of stop and reflect on his thinking, which I did see him do throughout that lesson. So by the end of that particular lesson, we were able to identify the plot, the three characters, the problem, and the solution.
So when you say we, do you mean the both of you, or was Jonathan?
He was able to clearly identify the characters on his own. The problem was that the Trixie in the story lost her bunny in the laundromat. Dad put it in there, didn't realize. So he and I actually had a longer conversation about the problem in the text, because he was under the impression that Dad purposefully put the bunny in the laundromat. So
in the washing machine. Yeah.
In the washing machine. And later on, we had to kind of really go back and reflect and look at the pictures and practice our inference making, which is what we practiced the 2 lessons before. Look at the pictures and see how we can figure out that Dad didn't do it on purpose. So that was actually something he had a lot of difficulty with.
So he was good. You felt like he was independently successful with identifying, characters. And did you mention setting? I feel like
the setting, he had a little bit of trouble. Yeah.
The setting, I actually had a question about the setting, not to get off topic, but he seemed to catch on to the setting as he was reading, but then there was a part where you wanted him to recognize the setting of being in New York City, or being in the city.
Yes.
And so one of my questions for that was, how does his background knowledge impact that response? So he said, I don't know.
Yeah.
And you were kind of probing him with well, is it a farm? And you're trying to find these extreme opposites, and he couldn't get to that point. So how do you feel like his background knowledge impacted his response and not knowing?
Well, I thought about it because I'm not from around here, this part of the state, and I think it is actually not rural, but it's a lot more rural than where I come from. But I'm also struggling with picking the right vocabulary to use to describe it to him, because I don't know if he could identify what a suburb was, which is what I think he's probably used to, not a city, like a bustling city, and also not a farm. So I was having a difficult time trying to figure out how to get him to that point, kind of like how you were having that same difficult time getting him to that table of contents. So I think in that regard, I definitely maybe was not appropriately kind of guiding him to that.
So can you share a little bit about his background that could have attributed him to not being able to not know, be able to look at
a city and say that's a city. Based on what I understand, he spends a lot of time with his family at home, and there's not a lot of extraneous traveling that goes on, even though, down here we're kind of close to Philadelphia. I asked him once if he had ever been there, and he stated that he hadn't. So as an example, I'm sure if a kid goes to Philadelphia, they would remember going there and seeing how different it is.
Yeah.
So for sure, that lack of maybe exposure to other types of neighborhoods and situations definitely affected his ability to identify that was New York City. Because especially granted, We maybe know the vocabulary, but those were brownstones clearly in New York somewhere. So unless you grew up there, or if you were exposed to maybe the row houses in Philadelphia, it would be difficult for you to identify that this is a city setting.
So I'm hearing you say, like, his lack of just experience had an impact on, you know, how he interacts with the story, where we might anticipate students being able to say, oh, that's totally New York City, because you kind of, you know, you see as he goes through the story, there's different parts of, you know, the New York, the park, like the park and things like that, you know, but it seems like due to his lack of experience, that like had an impact on him being able to identify certain parts of the setting. So I think it's important to kind of reflect on that when thinking about, like, you know, when we're looking at stories and things like that, and just learning about students that we're working with. So then you continued to, he continued to go through the story and kind of identify the different parts. And then there was a part where you asked Jonathan how the daddy felt. You know, the little girl was like having a tantrum, and he said, I don't know. And then you told him to think about it. So can you talk about, like, your reasoning for asking him that?
Sure. So in that particular book, the faces on all the characters are extremely expressive. And during that particular portion, the dad was clearly getting frustrated with Trixie, who was throwing a tantrum, who was trying to communicate to her father that something was wrong, and specifically she doesn't have Knuffle Bunny. So I was trying to have him focus on the facial expression and the illustration to have him come up with some idea of why the dad was reacting to Trixie that way. And not to show that he was mad, but to show more that he was confused and upset, and then eventually frustrated because the situation where the child is throwing a tantrum all the way back home would naturally frustrate anybody. But
so it sounds like you made like a thoughtful decision when he immediately said, I don't know, to say, well, think about it. And you seem like from what you're telling me, you had these goals in your head, and you could have just said, you know, after he said, I don't know, you could have said, well, he's feeling frustrated. But you made like the conscious thought to give him that wait time, you know, and that I think connects to one of the goals that you had in our pre-conference in saying, you know, giving him think time and not just like jumping in. You know, so I felt like that reflected on one of the goals that you had for the lesson, and you knew in your head what you wanted him to see. He said, I don't know, but you still gave it like that time. And, you know, some of your other goals were clarifying questions and then stopping at appropriate moments. So it seems like you know, were very conscious of the think time. What else, what do you feel about your lesson with the clarifying questions and then just stopping at the appropriate parts of the story?
I think he struggled a little bit with stopping and listening to the questions. He was very engaged in the text, and he kind of wanted to keep going. So I was trying to slow him down and think about each of those elements as we met them on the graphic organizer, as opposed to just reading the whole story and then going back. So this way we can kind of look for those specific moments or elements in the moments in the text as we approach them, so he can maybe think more or be more focused about thinking about what a setting looks like. How can I look for a setting? Well, we're looking at the pictures here for an instance. The pictures in the book tell most of the story.
So it does sound like you were purposefully stopping.
Yes.
He wanted to kind of jump ahead, but by being, you know, very thoughtful about where you stop, even though he wanted to keep going, you kind of made a conscious effort to say, no, we're going to stop at this point.
Yes, that's what I was trying to do, because again, he likes to rush through, and he doesn't give himself reflection time. So by writing as we're reading, we're able to pause and stop and go back into the text directly and make sure that what we're saying actually relates to what is being read in the text.
And in terms of clarifying questions, do you feel like you were successful in meeting that goal?
I think for part of the lesson, again, I think because I wrongfully assumed it would be a text he would be familiar with, the types of clarifying questions I would ask had to change as I realized that. So we had to kind of stop and really think about the relationship between Trixie and the father. So one of the questions I asked him later in the lesson was, why did he think the father would have purposely put the bunny in the washing machine? And he said, I really don't know. So we kind of talked about how we can infer the relationship between two characters based on their actions and based on what we know about their relationship. So by asking him about why he initially stated that the dad threw it in the washing machine on purpose, well, why do you think that? And then first he said, I don't know. And I said, well, think about it a little more. And he said, well, I guess it doesn't make sense because the dad is, he said, friends with Trixie. But and I said, well, what do you mean by friends? And he said, well, it's a dad and a daughter, so they want to be nice to each other, is what he ended up saying. So I think by him stopping and reflecting really on why he says what he says has been helping him in that particular quest for information when we went to go back and break down those stories.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you plan these clarifying questions, but based on some of the answers, you don't always anticipate. You have to keep clarifying for him. But I think that it seems like you're conscious of planning those questions, and at this point knowing, to be flexible with how to respond or how to ask another clarifying question, or help him bring clarification to the story. I want to go back to a few times you mentioned that you didn't anticipate him not knowing the text. We know, I even know Knuckle Bunny is a really popular story, and he had never been exposed to it before, and that caused you to change some of your questioning, and it seems like you had to support him a little bit more through the process of the story map. Can you reflect on if the text was familiar, what you might anticipate or what that might look like?
If the actual text was something that he had read before?
Yeah, so you anticipated he'd be familiar with it.
I'm sorry, so if the text was familiar before, then...
Before doing the story map. Because you anticipated Knuckle Bunny would be a book he kind of already knew, but...
So I think I would have been able to go deeper into the inferences that he would have been making, and connect more so to the lessons we've done before, which are those inferences, and hopefully make more complex connections between the plot and the characters and the problem that evolved in the story, had he actually been familiar with it.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought 55.
Yeah, but it's 8:52
Okay.
now.
Sorry, we're just recording, so we're done.
But she has to get in and get her room set up.
Okay.
She's bringing her kid in 3 minutes.
All right, thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Did that answer the question?
So you're saying that if you would have anticipated the text more, it would have been easier to kind of go through the inferencing and the story mapping process.
Sorry, I got a little off track.
It's okay.
All right, well,
thank you for sharing.
thank you for asking.